on nutrient requirements, RDA, and EAR of Indians. She also spearheaded My Plate of the Day, which provides food-based guidelines for meeting micro and macronutrient requirements to prevent undernutrition
Let her be brief,
and NCDs.
Let her be brief.
Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry.
Can we have the mics off, please? Somebody has the mic on. Sorry for the technical glitch. Yeah. Welcome all of you to this very important e-dialogue. This is a brief introduction about our director, and now I request her to deliver the welcome address for today's e-dialogue on taxing high-fat, sugar, and salty foods. Can it discourage consumption?
A very warm greetings to all the participants. I'm really happy to have you all on board. This is the fourth in the series of I think. Yeah, in the series of
fifth, ma'am. Yeah,
e-dialogues under the theme Let's Fix Up Food. We have completed on advertisements and advertising and food marketing, and then front of pack labeling, and this is the final one on food taxes. So thus far we have completed successfully, and this is the final one and very, very important one. All of us know well that the aim of food taxes is behavior change among consumers, and food taxes must discourage people from purchasing unhealthy foods and also promote healthy food behavior. And the outcome would be to see reduction in incidence of diet-related non-communicable diseases, including cardiovascular diseases. However, if not done with full knowledge, it will certainly lead to raise in revenue, but may not lead to change in food behavior, which has been faced in quite a few places in some countries. In our country, the present situation is unhealthy foods are inexpensive and easily available in every corner of our country. Even if you go to the remotest part of the country, even in the tribal and rural regions, you'll see inexpensive, cheaply available, highly processed, nutrient poor, and calorie-rich foods. While fresh foods are expensive, which might actually be contributing to the overconsumption of junk food because it's cheap and also easily available. By increasing the price of energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods, we hope to motivate not only consumers to go for healthy foods, but also manufacturers to produce healthier alternatives. However, as a consortium, we must remember that it is not as simple as increasing a tax on tobacco or alcohol. Food is very different. For instance, we are not sure what will work. Is it the food as a whole or nutrient? Or the nutrient source, what will work? Or will it be subsidies on healthy foods? I personally feel subsidies on healthy foods and making them available at every place would work better. And therefore, it requires a very, very well thought, comprehensive, and integrated food policy approach. Just increasing tax on sugar might not work because it will deter people from taking high sugar food, but then they might take other unhealthy foods which are commonly available. So it needs a very, very comprehensive policy approach to the whole process. So best wishes to the organizing team for a fruitful discussion. And as Dr. Subbarao has already mentioned, tomorrow we have minister's visit and our DG is coming from ICMR. So we have fully packed program tomorrow. I'm really very sorry. Actually, I love to be a part of this e-dialogue series and have whenever I'm in NIN, I make my remarks and I continue to attend the whole program. But unfortunately, today it's not possible. And actually, the final one is a very important one. Nevertheless, I would like to see the YouTube streaming which will be available after a few days as well. So again, next week also we are having this very huge international program. Thank you very much and my best wishes. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
All the best, Subbarao.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for taking time out and then making those very important remarks. And one thing that we'll deliberate in the panel discussion also is it just enough to increase taxes on unhealthy foods or also increase subsidies on healthy ones? That's a great point to take forward. Thank you for your time and thanks for those remarks.
Thank you, Subramanian. Thank you all the panelists.
Yes. Kiran, can we just move ahead with the next program?
Yes, sir. Now it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Subbarao, sir, who's leading the Let's Fix Our Food initiative and who's also the head of niche division at National Institute of Nutrition. I request Dr. Subbarao to give his valuable insights on Let's Fix Our Food initiative, as well as to flag some issues related to food taxation on HFSS foods to discourage consumption. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Kiran. I'll quickly share this screen. In 5 minutes of my talk, what I'll try and do is I'll only give an overview of the activities of Let's Fix Our Food initiative and the e-dialogues per se. And from there, I leave the floor to the economists and learned people to talk about the topic today. Just to give a brief background, as we've mentioned in emails to all of you, and also for those who are joining us online remotely from elsewhere, who do not have a background of what the initiative is all about, we would like to inform you that this has been thought out as a consortium in the context of growing overweight, obesity, and the alarming rates at which the overweight, obesity are increasing among adolescents who occupy about 20% of our total population size. And we see alarming rates of increase in them of obesity and overweight. And that's the context. And then and many of the boys and girls are even unable to meet the minimum requirement of physical activities. Added to that, the increasing availability and affordability of not so healthy or unhealthy foods, and also the rising prices of the healthy foods are costly. I mean, that's what many studies elsewhere in the world and also in the country show. In this context, one thing that was thought out in a meeting with the Niti Aayog of many of the partners in 2021 was to start a high-level dialogue on prevention of maternal, adolescent, and childhood obesity, from which 5 policy actions were thought out. These are the 5 policy actions, if you can see where my cursor is running. One is regulating private and public media advertising of high fat, sugar, and salt foods. Second one is promoting nutrition literacy among adolescents and front of pack nutrition labeling, which India is now at a very advanced stage of introducing one. But I don't know, I mean, there are a lot of debates around it. At the same time, there is also taxation of HFSS foods, which is one of the topics, and also double duty actions. So in this consortium, what we thought out is that this is a group of many like-minded organizations. This e-dialogue series is being sponsored by UNICEF and spearheaded by the National Institute of Nutrition. And then in this consortium, we have several partners who are coming together to the main objective of this particular consortium is to give a voice, not just a voice, but also a space for the adolescents and youth leaders to actually share their life experiences and be part of the policy making scenario for improving their food environment. So in many of our conversations, we know that young people and adolescents are missing. So the idea is to generate nationwide representative information of capturing the voices of the younger ones, and also foster their engagement and opportunities in public actions. And to this particular end, a lot of activities are being done by the consortium partners. One such activity is e-dialogue, wherein in almost all the e-dialogues that we've conducted so far, we've had the adolescent and youth leaders come and share their views and be panelists and then talk about their views and then issues, problems, barriers, and also enablers. In fact, in the previous e-dialogue, the 4th one on nutrition literacy, we've had an entire panel discussion with adolescents being the participants, and they were the ones who were airing their opinions. So in this last one, unfortunately, we could not get any adolescents to speak because it's a very highly technical topic, and then it needs some amount of economics expertise. So we are also just facilitating the entire thing, and even the moderation is being done by a renowned economist. So that's how we planned the e-dialogues. And as I said, as part of this consortium, we plan to get the policy actions, which is the final outcome, but through adolescent engagement and also the capacity building. And in this ecosystem, we have a lot of like-minded organizations coming together. Some of them are enabling partners, some of them are implementing partners, and some of them are, the adolescents are the integral part. There are other enabling partners for e-dialogues who support in terms of finding the right panel and then getting the right points for discussion. And they include the UNICEF India, Public Health Foundation of India, then Niti Aayog itself. And in the first few e-dialogues, we've had the Ministry of Information Broadcasting. Then IFPRI had played an important role in putting together this panel today. And also the entire consortium is still expanding. And then we have many more like-minded organizations which are displayed on the right side of the screen, and many more such organizations planning to join the consortium and then increase the impact on of the activities that we are doing. So as part of this, Public Health Foundation of India is trying to do a 1 million survey, wherein they are trying to get an understanding of what nudges young people to choose the foods, whether healthy or unhealthy. What are the various nudges that are actually prompting them for food choices. 1 million surveys going, and where NIN and other organizations are enabling partners. But for e-dialogues, we are implementing partners. And then we've done 4 successful e-dialogues. The first two on advertising and marketing of unhealthy foods on media, and the second one on nutrition literacy, and third one on front of pack nutrition labeling. So today is the most important one on taxation, and this will bring it to an end on the e-dialogue series, I think by this year. And we are wrapping up this e-dialogue series. Perhaps we have much more to do in the coming years. So with this brief background, I now welcome the panelists and also the speakers today. May I request my colleague, Dr. Reshma, to please introduce our first speaker.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon again. I apologize again for the technical glitch. I request Dr. Subarasu to make me the co-host so that I could share the screen. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. You can please share the screen now.
Yes, sir. So my screen is visible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you, sir. It's my pleasure to invite a dynamic speaker, Dr. Meera Shekhar, Global Lead Nutrition Program Manager, Nutrition TF. She provides leadership support and policy advice on the bank's nutrition portfolio. She led the repositioning of the nutrition agenda that led to the global scaling of nutrition movement. She steered the development of the Global Investment Framework for Nutrition and co-leads with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's my pleasure to invite Dr. Meera Shekhar to throw some light upon the possibility of taxation on HFSS foods. Dr. Meera Shekhar, to you.
Thank you very much, Reshma and Dr. Subbarao and the entire team for inviting me to this very exciting conversation around taxation on unhealthy foods. I must say I'm very, very pleased to be here with you today. But I also want to say, let's see. Can you see my slides? Okay. I also want to say, Dr. Subbarao, I work for the World Bank, but I'm not an economist. I'm an epidemiologist and still very interested in this agenda. So I will speak a little bit about some of the fiscal policies around consumption of unhealthy foods across the world. Okay, for some reason, the slides aren't moving. Okay. So very quickly to go back to the big issue, why are we so interested in this issue? I think everybody knows that nutrition touches more SDGs than any other. And today, with everything that is going on in the world, from pandemics to food prices to climate change and the economic crisis, there is the impetus for action is even stronger than it ever had been before. And if you look across the world, whether it is stunting, anemia, obesity, or other adverse malnutrition outcomes, they are happening all over the world. So it's not just one part of the world, but everywhere these problems are being, are in fact growing as we move. And especially on the obesity side, we know that in the 1990s, you see this graphic on the left-hand side, the map of the world. And then on the right-hand side, you see what it looks like in the 2010s and the 2020s. And you specifically might want to look at the map where India was so yellow. It was yellow on the obesity side, which means low obesity. And today it is much, much higher than it was at that time. The other thing it's really important to remember that is that 70% of the overweight obese individuals actually live in either low or middle income countries. People think sometimes that obesity is a problem of the rich countries, rich people. That's not the case. And in fact, 55% of the rise that we have seen in overweight or obesity is in rural areas. And we all know that obesity is closely associated, as the director said as well, with non-communicable diseases. So it's really critical to address this issue. And one of the reasons we are seeing this increase is because of an increase in unhealthy diets and decreased physical activity. And here you can see on the x-axis the daily caloric supply, and then on the y-axis the percent of population or adult men that are overweight or obese. You can see, fortunately, India is doing better than many other countries, but we have seen a rapid increase. So we want to be able to prevent it before it gets as bad as it is in countries on the right-hand side, like the US, where I am at the moment, Germany or Egypt, or Morocco for that matter, very high rates. So we want to prevent it from happening rather than try and treat it at a later time. Based on some of the work that has been done by WHO, we've recognized that over the past 50 odd years, the food supply has become, it has changed dramatically. And there are many, many more processed foods and added ingredients added into our food. And there are 3 nutrients of concern that WHO has recognized. First are free sugars, that is sugar that is naturally occurs in food, as well as added sugars. Sodium, which we all know is referred to as sodium chloride or salt, and then trans fats, which are really important as well. All of these have health impacts that are worrisome. I also want to say over here that there is also a lot of concern around, beyond these 3 ingredients or nutrients of concern, there's also a lot of concern about ultra-processed foods. The challenge with ultra-processed foods, or doing anything about that, is that we don't have a clear definition of what is ultra-processed and what is not. Efforts are ongoing to do something like the NOVA classification to identify ultra-processed foods, but we're not there as yet where we can identify it very clearly. So let's look at why we worry so much about trans fats. And you can see over here that consumption of trans fats is very closely associated with heart disease and death. On the y-axis, you see the number of deaths, and on the x-axis are different countries. And unfortunately, this is one area where India is well beyond all the other countries. So all the trans fats that we have in our diets are really adding to the mortality related to that. And evidence shows, and this is work done by the World Obesity Federation, that today the world is losing about 1.8, not today, in 2019, when this estimate was done, about 1.8% of GDP is being lost to obesity-related causes. In 2060, if we don't do anything about that, we will have losses of up to 3.6% of GDP. So GDP losses will double by 2060 if we don't do anything about it. Besides the health issues, these economic losses are absolutely critical as well. And this was based on a study done by the World Obesity Federation in several countries, and including in India, as you can see on this slide. So as far as these issues are concerned, there are potentially cost-effective interventions. On the left-hand side of the slide are WHO best buys, and I know somebody from WHO is going to talk, so I won't talk too much about it. But on the right-hand side of the slide is a package of interventions. And I want to emphasize, I know, Dr. Subbarao, you've said that you already talked about front of package labeling and marketing and so on, and so media campaigns as well. But I just want to emphasize that doing only one thing out of these, that like taxation, will not solve the problem. We need to do all of the above, package them in order to be successful. So there are more than 60 countries, actually it seems many more than 60 countries that are currently taxing sugar-sweetened beverages all over the world. And that number is growing. I can't keep up with the slide because that number is growing so quickly. But I also want to say, and I think the director referred to this, while there is a lot of work going on in terms of taxing sugar-sweetened beverages, which is one of the major sources of sugar in many diets, no country is currently subsidizing healthy non-processed foods. So this is certainly an area to think about, but we need to think about designing those very, very carefully. In addition to that, more than 90 countries, though most of them are high-income countries, but they have started efforts to reduce salt. And again, it is a multi-pronged approach. I don't want to get into the details of that, but it's the same thing, that it's not just one strategy to reduce salt consumption. Taxation is a small part of it, but there are many other strategies, including reformulation of the foods to reduce the salt in the food that is supplied. Now, coming to sugar-sweetened beverage taxation, just to give you a few examples, Mexico has a 10% tax of the beverages on the beverages, and the tax is levied in terms of volumes. This was implemented in 2014. And it includes taxation on any non-alcoholic beverage that has added sugar, exempts dairy beverages, and it exempts 100% juices. I won't talk too much about Mexico because I understand you have Dr. Colchero speaking later about the Mexico example, but I'll give you some of the other examples as well. So in the Gulf states, their taxation rate is very, very high. 50% on sugary drinks or aerated drinks, and 100% on energy drinks. So very different approach in the Gulf states. In South Africa, the taxation is, again, about 10%, and it's based on the grams of sugar, not on the volume as in Mexico, but on the number of grams of sugar. And they've designed it very carefully, where the first 4 grams per 100 ml is exempt from taxes. And it's only after the first 4 grams that the taxation comes into place. And in case there is no labeling on the sugar, then they just assume that tax is based on 20 grams sugar. So that is a way to encourage manufacturers to do better labeling. And just to clarify, in South Africa, they have exempted dairy products, even though they have some added sugars. certainly 100% fruit or vegetable juices, and powders as well. So you can see every country designs the taxes based on their context. And this is a timeline of how taxes were designed in South Africa. And I just wanted to show you how long it takes. From 2013, they started research on how to do taxation, and then did a series of conversations, public hearings, parliamentary hearings, so on and so forth. And they got the presidential sign-off in 2018. So this is just to say it does take time, and one needs to be patient on how to put taxes in place. We have seen that the tax in South Africa that has been put, it's called the Health Promotion Levy, has really been successful after making such an effort of going through such a long and iterative process on how to design these taxes. They show that the consumption has gone down. There is reformulation of the drinks, both the content as well as the size. You can see the bottles over there that have been reduced. And very interestingly, the lower socioeconomic groups have responded the most, which shows that the taxation is progressive. It benefits the poor the most. And as you can see on the right-hand side, there has been a reduction in purchases from about 16 grams per capita per day to about 10.6 grams per capita per day. And this is extremely successful. We've seen these sorts of things in other countries as well. So what are the big lessons that we're learning from South Africa? First, you do need a stable political landscape and support from politicians, absolutely critical. And I hope that India will use the G20 opportunity, the hosting of the G20, not only to further India's taxation policies on unhealthy foods, but also signal to the rest of the world that this is possible and this should be done. I won't go through all of the details, but I do want to mention one thing on the right-hand side as to what didn't work very well. We had a conversation with the South Africa team about 2 weeks ago, and they said that one of the biggest challenges was, one, industry was framing the problem as if you put taxes, you will lose jobs. And in fact, all the evidence in the world has shown that you do not lose any jobs. That this is this claim is not based on evidence at all. Secondly, it is really important to communicate to the larger public why these taxes are being put in place and what are the harmful effects of sugar. Currently, that is not the case all over the world, and it's really important to do that alongside the taxation. So here are some criteria for a good excise tax that the South African team came up with. And it's really important. I won't go through all of these details, but just to say, most important that it needs to be a simple design for taxation, and it should be easy to understand for the average person. So they know why it's being done and they don't rally against it. And it also needs to target cheap products, inexpensive products that will be consumed by the poor. And it should incentivize an appropriate supply response from the producers as well, which means they need to start reformulating, which is what we saw in South Africa. We've seen that in many other countries. And lastly, to say, reiterate what I've been saying earlier, fiscal policies, absolutely critical, but they need to be put in place along with other policies that will focus on behavior change. So with that, I'm going to say a big thank you. And one last comment let me make, that there are countries like Chile, for example, that have very, very successfully reduce the consumption of unhealthy foods. They didn't start with taxation. They really started much more with labeling and marketing regulations and so on and so forth. So there are many ways to get to that. And every country needs to chart its own way. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Meera. That was a very insightful talk. And if there are any questions from the co-panelists, we'll quickly take one or two. Okay, if there are none, I have a question. And when I said economist, you work for the world's biggest economic organization. So you are a half economist. And then we see that very well in your presentation. The question that I wanted to ask was, you cited the South African example. Sorry for lack of knowledge, but apart from the taxation, what other measures actually made even the poor reduce their consumption? Did they also try and make the healthy foods affordable?
So they didn't quite do that. In fact, there is no country, as I was saying, that has subsidized healthy foods. That is indeed the case. But what they did put in place was some of the other strategies around marketing of unhealthy foods, around education of the community as to what the harmful effects of this thing. But they also came back, and one of their lessons is they should have done much more on the nutrition education of the average public and letting the public know why these foods are being taxed. So yeah, unfortunately, like I said, not a single country has subsidized healthy foods as yet. Hopefully we can get there.
Okay, we have one question in the Q&A box, which asks, do we have any taxation for value-added beverages like coffee and tea? Perhaps this is given the context that they also are substantial sources for added sugar.
Not that I'm aware of. They certainly are potential sources for added sugar, but it's sugar added on top of, I think, tea itself or coffee itself does not have sugar. It's when it's sold as a packaged product that it does have sugar. So as far as I know, no countries have currently taxed those. But like I said, it's country context. Some countries will start to consider those. At the moment, the focus has been on sugar sweetened beverages, some other carbonated beverages as well, and in some cases, fruit juices that are not 100% fruit juice. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, although we are running out of time, we have one very important question by Dr. Preeto. I'll request her to ask the question herself.
Thank you, Dr. Meera. Just wanted to know,
we can't hear you.
Then maybe request that you can ask.
Okay, she has put a question. She says, do we have any already existing frameworks on how to advocate for unhealthy food taxation at the country level? How to advocate for this? Do we have any blueprint for that?
So there is no blueprint, and we don't want one recipe for every country to follow. But there are certainly lessons. And the example I showed you from South Africa is one example of how it can be done. It needs to be tailored to the specific country context. But if you see that timeline that shows you how it had to go through a process of including scientists and doing the research on it first, and then taking it to politicians, and then having parliamentary discussions and so on and so forth as well. And if you see in Chile, they used a very different approach. They didn't start with taxation. They started with marketing regulations, advertising, front of package labeling. I don't know if you've seen the packaging from Chile, where it has a big stop sign on every package. Yes. And that led to reductions in consumption. So I'm sorry, there's no single recipe, and we don't want a single recipe to be used in every country, but one needs to learn from the experience of these other countries and tailor it to the country context itself.
Thank you so much for those insightful points. We request you to stay on if your time permits. I know you're joining us at a very odd hour in the morning. Nevertheless, I'm sure it's going to be very interactive and very nice session ahead. May I request my colleague Kiran to go ahead and introduce our next speaker?
Yes, sir. It's my pleasure to invite our dynamic international speaker, Professor Catherine Backholler. She's the co-director, Global Center for Preventive Health and Nutrition at Deakin University, Australia. Her research focuses on building the global evidence to support healthy and equitable food and nutrition policies, with a particular focus on food pricing policies and food marketing controls. I request Professor Catherine to give her valuable insights on the topic food and beverage taxes.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me today. It's nighttime here. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that? Yep. Okay, great. So I'll be talking today. A lot of the points I'll be talking today have been mentioned already, but I think the way I'll be presenting it will be a slightly different twist, and I think or take on the presentation, and really focused on how industry is likely to respond to a tax on either sugary drinks or foods, and how, I guess it gets to that last question of how public health can be ready to respond to industry when you do get that pressure. So we know that ultra-processed foods and unhealthy foods have been increasing rapidly over the last 20 years or so. So this is data, the retail value of packaged ultra-processed foods and drinks in India from 2006 to 2019. And you can see it just keeps increasing across time up to current days. And this has huge health consequences. I'm not going to go into this in detail because I think everyone else on the line is aware of this. But obviously linked to overweight and obesity, and in India, as with many low middle income countries, it's the rate of increase of obesity that's a real problem. And we know that this is also linked to many other health consequences, one of which is really important, tooth decay. So one that gets left off. Tooth decay, one of the most common reasons for hospitalizations across the world, with 50 to 80% of Indian adults with tooth decay, and one of the most common forms of chronic illness. And we know that that's driven entirely by free sugar intake. And so when we think about food taxes, they've really been proposed to get to address these health conditions, these unsustainable rising costs and health conditions within a given country. And we know that the current prices of unhealthy foods and beverages do not reflect their actual cost to society. So the intention of these kinds of taxes are fourfold. Number one is to increase the retail price of unhealthy foods and drinks and thereby reduce consumption, which would then flow on to public health benefits. Number two, it would raise revenue, which could then be reinvested back into public health. So I absolutely agree. I think subsidies on fruit and vegetables, for example, are really important. But you need money, you need government revenue to be able to provide those subsidies. So by raising revenue, that could be reinvested back into those kinds of subsidies. It certainly sends a powerful message to the public that regular consumption of unhealthy foods and drinks are not part of a healthy diet. And if designed well, they can also incentivize the food industry to reformulate their products to lower sugar, low fat, lower salt products, and change the entire food supply. But we know around the world there's huge industry pushback. We've seen this millions and millions of dollars spent on single campaigns in many jurisdictions around the world with sugary drinks taxes. And so what I wanted to present today are a number of opposing arguments for sugary drinks taxes and food taxes. So what are the key arguments against these taxes? And then what are the evidence-based counterpoints to those? So the first one is that individuals should be responsible for their diets, not governments. So this really speaks to what some call the nanny state argument, that individuals need to take responsibility. It's not up to governments to take responsibility. But we know that the costs of overweight and obesity, the cost of diet-related diseases are borne by governments. So actually governments do have legitimacy to act here. In 2019, the economic impact of overweight and obesity was estimated to be almost $30 billion in India. And if left unchecked, if nothing changes, this is predicted to go up to about 840 billion in India. And we know that governments around the world have also used tax as a way of reducing consumption of other harmful products, so alcohol and tobacco, for example. The next opposing argument, there is no support for food taxes around the world. And as you just heard, and as I'll tell you again, huge numbers of countries right around the world have implemented taxes, more than 60 jurisdictions with some form of food or beverage tax, mainly sugary drinks taxes, covering more than 3 billion people worldwide. So huge traction around worldwide. We have UN organisations, many public health and consumer groups that support the application of unhealthy foods and food and beverage taxes. And then again, importantly, when you look at surveys that ask the public, global surveys that ask the public if they support taxes on unhealthy foods, the percentage of those that do support these kinds of taxes increases if you say that the revenue would be reinvested back to subsidise healthy foods. So by using the revenue subsidising healthy foods, you can massively increase the public support for these kinds of taxes. The next argument, that similar taxes in other countries have failed. I mean, if you hear this argument, we know now that this is just incorrect. We have so many studies now, especially on sugary drinks taxes. So that if you look at the bottom paper here, this is a systematic review and meta-analyses of evaluations of sugary drinks taxes around the world. And the summary here was that the equivalent of a 10% sugary drinks tax was associated with an average decline in beverage purchases and dietary intake of 10%. So we know these sugary drinks taxes work. For food taxes, the evidence is less clear because there are less policy examples around the world. But a recent evaluation of economic and health outcomes associated with both food taxes and subsidies showed that for food taxes, there was evidence to show that food taxes increase prices of unhealthy foods and reduce the sales of those foods. So there's certainly, where there is evidence available, it is positive evidence. It's showing that these taxes are effective. And then when a tax has been tied to the amount, to a nutrient within a food or beverage, we see not only impacts on purchases, but impacts on the whole entire food supply. So this is the UK Sugary Drinks Levy, which imposed one tax for every 5 grams per 100 ml of sugar, and then a higher tax, a second tax on 8 grams per 100 ml of sugar. 8 grams of sugar per 100 ml of beverage. And you can see the potential for reformulation. So you've got 7-Up here, a lemonade drink, and you've got Sprite down here, a lemonade drink. 7-Up, 11 grams of sugar per 100 ml, and Sprite, just over 6 grams of sugar per 100 ml. So you can see the potential to reduce sugar content in these beverages. And when you look at the evaluation after the tax was implemented, sorry, the graphs come off here. If you look at the evidence after the tax was implemented, the UK actually did see a decline in the sugar across the food supply for those drinks that were taxed. So a reduction in sugar right across the beverages, the taxed beverages in the UK, which will have huge public health implications. And I think it's also important, as was just mentioned, that we shouldn't be looking to these taxes as a silver bullet. I think that is one of the most important points to make, and was made just previously as well, that it won't be a silver bullet. We shouldn't be looking at obesity as an outcome. We should be looking at the change in purchases. We should be looking at changes in consumption, and that should be enough, really. If we see a change in population diets, we know that that will lead to a change in obesity over the longer term. This is a complex problem. Obesity sits in a complex system, and even if we can tweak that system by changing one aspect of a complex system, then that is enough. And we know, we saw this with tobacco control. So in Australia, we have one of the lowest smoking rates in the world. We have really high taxes. And this is our prevalence of smoking over time from 1980 to 2007. It's even lower now. But we have really high taxes, yet it was always different measures over time, every single arrow pointing to this graph that resulted to our low prevalence of smoking. So we need a comprehensive approach. Next argument is that food taxes are regressive. And I think this is, so in other words, the poor people would be hit the hardest, so they'd be paying the most in tax. And this is certainly around the world, one of the most common arguments, and probably one of the most sensitive at the moment as we find ourselves living in a cost of living crisis. So I think this is actually a really important argument at the moment. For sugary drinks taxes, I think it's relatively more straightforward to counter this argument, and because we have good evidence now for the Mexican evaluation that lower income households are more responsive to a sugar sweetened beverage tax. So 1 year post implementation, we saw that lower income households reduced their purchase of sugary drinks taxes more than the general population. And I know someone will be speaking to this, Dr. Colchero, later, so I won't speak to that study, but impressive study, and we certainly follow all the evidence coming out of Mexico here in Australia. But I think it's harder for foods. For foods, the financial impact is across a greater number of products. And I think one way in which this argument can be addressed is that when we think about taxes, when we think about subsidies, we should be thinking about rebalancing the price of foods and beverages. So not just about increasing the price of unhealthy foods, but how do you rebalance the relative price so that healthy foods are relatively more affordable? And so when we think about the impacts on the poor and the impacts on the, in the cost of living crisis, I think having taxes on foods could be appropriate if the revenue went back to subsidise healthy foods. And then the last argument is that food taxes will harm business and cost jobs. And again, I'll just briefly mention this because Dr. Colchero is online again, but in Mexico so far we haven't seen any evidence of this, certainly for their SSB tax and then food tax. Oh, last argument, the beverage industry should be part of the solution. So this is a really sensitive argument. A lot of governments around the world think that, or would like to have industry at the table, at the political table. And it's really, I think this is really difficult. We know that large food companies, the publicly traded, have a legal obligation to act in the interests of its shareholders and to maximise sales and profits to the full extent permitted by law. That is the role of the company to its shareholders. So there's a clear conflict of interest when it comes to reducing the consumption of its products. So of course they're going to oppose government intervention, which has the primary goal to reduce the population consumption of the very products that it sells. So huge conflicts of interest there. And the industry knows that. This is from the 2019 Coca-Cola report where they outlined the risks to the company. And you can see here that corporates are vulnerable to more frequent regulatory interventions such as taxes on sugar. Coca-Cola Amatil continues to engage with stakeholders to raise awareness of the impacts of additional regulations and develop initiatives to achieve public policy objectives with minimal impact to consumers and the group. So of course they're going to oppose sugary drinks taxes. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much for having me, and happy to take questions. Thank you.
If there are any quick questions from the co-panelists or the attendees. Yeah, thank you, Catherine, for that very nicely put presentation wherein you have brought out the arguments that the industry usually makes. But my question still remains. I think that's one of the questions that we're going to ask the panelists also, is that how good is the industry itself as a partner in this initiative? Should we do it as regulatory forces, academics plus academia plus the scientists plus the others versus the industry, or is it industry? Should we take the industry also into our ambit and then try and work together? Which is the best way?
I mean, my view is that industry should be at the table at implementation stage, not at policy design, because there's clear conflicts of interest. You're talking about a policy that will reduce the sales of the products that they sell. So there's a clear conflict of interest there. We know in countries around the world, for any kind of food policy, as soon as industry is at the table, it's watered down. So the policy design is watered down, and the public health benefits are also watered down. So I think to get a strong policy, or to get any policy, I think it's going to be watered down no matter what. Industry will always be in the ears of government. So often what industry will say, will ask for exemptions. They'll ask for a lower tax rate. They'll ask for exemptions. So exemptions on juices, on flavoured milks, on all sorts of exemptions. So I think if you have industry at the table, there needs to be really clear conflict of interest guidelines where there's transparency throughout the whole entire process in terms of when policymakers speak to industry, when they don't, what meetings the industry at, but preferably they be at the table at implementation, not design.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. And then we'll move to the next presentation in the interest of the time. I hope you'll stay along for the rest of the session. May I request Reshma to please introduce the next speaker?
Thank you, sir. Am I audible? Our next speaker is dynamic, and our next speaker is our dynamic speaker, Dr. Aranza Colcharo Aragon. She's an associate professor, Health Economics Unit Center for Health System Research, National Institute of Public Health, Mexico. She has been working on the design and impact evaluation of fiscal policies to reduce the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods, and alcohol in Mexico, as well as marketing and labeling regulations in Chile. Her interests also include the analysis of the Mexican health system, the response of healthcare needs, and to COVID-19 from the demand and supply side overall and for the most vulnerable populations. Other topics of interest include the estimation of health and economic burden of suboptimal breastfeeding practices in Mexico. Dr. Aranza Colcharo, I may please request you to put some light upon the lessons learned from SSB tax in Mexico.
Thank you very much. Very glad to be here. I'm going to share my screen. I think it says that I cannot share my screen. Okay.
Now you can. Now you know.
Thank you. I don't know why I can't do that. Let me see. Right. Okay, so can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the lessons learned from the fiscal policies implemented in Mexico. And so this is something that you already know. And by 2020, there were 45 countries and cities and regions with SSB taxes, but now there are 50. And this is based on the health impacts of increasing trends in SSB consumption all over the world. And the problem is that these are available, SSBs are available, affordable, with marketing linked to habits, and everything is linked to habits and compulsive behaviors. So it is really difficult to make behavioral changes if we don't have structural policies to tackle this epidemic of high consumption of SSBs and health-related damages. And we have to say also, we have to talk about the environmental impacts. It's not only, it's the combination of the health impacts but also the environmental impacts related to the production of SSBs. And taxes are just incentives to reduce consumption. So what was the context in Mexico to introduce a tax? So we had, and we still have, very high prevalence of overweight and obesity, diabetes, and other chronic diseases. Mexico at that time was one of the highest consumers of SSBs, and added sugars represented 12.5% of total energy intake, and within that, 7% were SSBs. Now, we also have non-essential energy dense foods that represented about 16% of total energy intake. So in that context, Mexico implemented a tax in 2014, which is a tax to volume of 1 peso per liter. And it includes, this is a tax to all non-alcoholic beverages with added sugar. It includes milk that has added sugar. It excludes 100% juices. We didn't have at that time a lot of 100% juices. These are increasing, and we should tax them. And it didn't include beverages with artificial sweeteners. Well, I'll talk about this at the end of my presentation, but they should also be included based on a systematic review published by the WHO, and in terms of the damages, but also because we are concerned that the kids will get used to the sweetness if they drink these beverages. So the tax is higher for larger package sizes, which this is an adequate tax because in Mexico and probably in other countries, these larger package sizes are less expensive, relatively less expensive, and so this tax they have to pay more. This is a tax that is paid by the producers. And it is adjusted to inflation since 2019 annually automatically. So we also have a food tax. So this is an 8% ad valorem tax. The SSB tax is an excise tax, and the food tax is an 8% ad valorem tax. And it includes, this is the list of the products that are under this tax. So this tax if it has more than 275 kilocalories per 100 grams. So it includes salty snacks, confectionery, chocolates, puddings, sweetened fruits or vegetables, peanut or healthy butter, milk, candies, ice cream, and cereal-based products. We have in Mexico, people eat a lot of sweet bread, and it has a tax. So the Ministry of Finance had to publish a list of foods that are essential and are not taxed, because there were, at the beginning, there was a lot of confusions. So wheat, food based on wheat, corn, or other cereals like baby cereals and sweetened cereal-based products are not taxed. So what are the results of the impact evaluation? So what you first expect is prices to raise, and this is a graph that shows how much prices increase after the implementation of the tax. And you can see there's a lot of heterogeneity. In urban areas, which is about 85% of the population lives in urban areas in Mexico, there was a complete pass-through. There was a lower, an incomplete pass-through in rural areas. It was less than 100% pass-through. For carbonated beverages, there was a complete pass-through, and for non-carb, which is mainly what soft drinks, and this is mainly what the Mexican population drinks. We drink less juices because they are more expensive, and so there was an incomplete pass-through for juices and flavored water. So what happened? What do we see in terms of the impact on purchases and sales? So there are different studies. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail, but the first studies using a panel of households in urban areas show reductions of 7.6% in the 2 years after implementation of the tax, of 7.6%, and increases in untaxed beverages. We had higher reductions among lower SES households and high consumers. Just quickly to say that in Mexico, the consumption of SSBs and high energy dense food is higher among the rich, still higher among the rich. The same for the prevalence of obesity and overweight. But with what we saw is positive in terms of the concerns related to regressivity, is that the higher reductions were among the lower SES households. At the national level, we also found for the first year a reduction of 6.3% on SSBs, higher reduction among households of lower income in urban areas and with children and adolescents, and very similar findings from sales, and higher findings from a study that used a panel of households, an urban panel, but only data before and after, didn't control for previous trends as the other ones. There's also evaluations of the food tax, and as it was mentioned, these type of taxes are not very common there are very few in other countries, and we think this is a tax that includes food with sugar content and salt and fat, and this is a good tax because it just reduces the probability of substitutions from SSBs to food that has sugar. So the evaluations found, again, with the panel of households, a 6% reduction of taxes, not tax beverages, but food taxes, and also high reductions among lower SES households and high consumers. And at the national level, there was a reduction of 5.3% and higher reductions again among lower income urban household and children with adolescents, which is not bad because we have a tax of 8%. So again, yes, there was a lot of concern about the impacts on employment, and the industry said that they would lose about 10,000 jobs, so about 10% reductions in employment. And so we conducted a study using publicly available data to look at the impact on the beverage industry and the industry that produces the food under the tax. And we didn't see any reductions in employment, neither in stores. There was a concern that there would be a reduction in employment overall, but it's particularly in small stores. We have a lot of small stores in Mexico, and we didn't see that. And the reason why we don't see an impact on employment is that we have a pretty small tax, but also because the industry and the stores, the industry produces the substitute, which is bottled water, and the stores also sell the substitute. So this is why we didn't see any reductions in employment. Just very quickly, I don't have it in my slide, but we also conducted a study where we found positive effects on dental caries, which is an immediate indicator for the impact of a tax on sugar, on SSBs and food taxes. And there are other modern studies looking at the impact on health, and they show that they can be a reduction in overweight and obesity and diabetes. And just to quickly, it was mentioned in other presentations, but evidence in the world, I think it's because there are so many countries that have implemented taxes, and now there's a lot of not all of them have impact evaluations, but as evidence from systematic reviews and meta-analysis show that even though there's heterogeneity on the pass-through prices and on changes in consumption, purchases, or sales, it's been shown that a 10% increase in prices is associated with a 10% reductions in consumption. There's no robust evidence for negative impacts on employment, industry, or government revenues. And on health, mostly they come from studies based on current taxes. So what are the challenges that we face in Mexico? So there are, and in the world, we don't have studies. We are just conducting a study looking at the impact on overall diet, and it hasn't been published yet, but we find that there wasn't an increase in overall energy intake in Mexico, which is a positive impact. So there were not substitutions for beverages, except that there was an increase in bottled water. But we still need to conduct these studies because there's a claim that they may be substitutions. Again, the impact on health is based on modern studies. In Mexico, unfortunately, revenues cannot be earmarked, and it would be very good to be able to do it, not all revenues, but part of them, because we know that the population will be more convinced if there was earmark, and then we can increase resources for the health reform that is needed in the country. And we, as I mentioned, our tax is very small, and taxes have not increased, and the current government doesn't want to increase taxes. But from a publication from PAJO, we know that the tax share of the SSB tax in Mexico is only 5.3% compared to Chile, which is 15%. So there's a lot of room for increasing taxes, and we always think about optimal taxes that can reduce consumption, that can get savings from improvements in health, and no negative impact on employment or inequity. So finally, the next steps, well, even because we know that taxes increase prices, reduce consumption, this is a proof of concept in the world. We suggest to keep taxes and increase, but of course, combine with other strategies to address the impact of unhealthy eating on health and the environment, based on the Eat Lancet recommendations. Incentives such as incentives to produce and consume healthier food and beverages. So using subsidies, we are conducting several studies to see the feasibility and the response to subsidies. Reducing the availability of unhealthy choices, that they are everywhere. And of course, the more system reform. Just to add very quickly that in Mexico, we have a front of pack labeling, warning labels since November 2020. We have regulations in schools and marketing regulations since 2014. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that insightful talk, and then the example of a country, how it moved from what it was to discouraging unhealthy foods, especially sugar sweetened beverages, and against the popular understanding that it would affect the poor, it actually showed to have decreased the consumption among the poor population. It's an interesting example. We have a question in the box which says, should the proposed regulations on HFSS foods be applicable to traditional sweets and savories also? This is an important question in the Indian context. I don't know how familiar you with the Indian context, that we have a lot of these sweet meat shops, which are mostly unorganized sector. Should they also be taxed? And it's an important part of our daily food consumption. So this is, a question from one of the participants.
Yes, so because we have a food tax, and it includes traditional sweets, because so the sweets, and even if they are traditional sweets, we also have traditional sweets in Mexico. If they have more than 2,075 kilocalories per 100 grams, they are taxed. If they are packets, so this is, all taxes are applied to packaged food. So if they are taxed, and they are very nice, our traditional sweets, but they have a lot of sugar also.
Okay, there is a question from co-panelist, Dr. Beena, if you want to ask. Dr. Beena Varghese, you raised your hand. Do you want to ask a question? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. There is an echo on my end. Is there an echo on your end?
Yes, perhaps you're logging in from two devices. I'm not sure.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, you can mute one of them and it'll work.
Okay,
yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I can hear my own voice too much.
I can hear you well.
Okay, good. Okay. So the question is regarding the tax part, where you said that if you tax 10%, the pass-through was 100% for many of your products. And given that the tax is a small component of the entire price, I just wanted to understand, how did that happen?
No, so there was a complete pass-through in the amount of the tax in urban areas, but it wasn't complete in rural areas. So there was a lot of heterogeneity.
Okay.
But the other thing, so for the publication from PAJO that looked at the methods to standardize taxes, so you could compare what was the share in terms of the final price, it's 5.3%. So it's not, so the tax in Mexico is an excise tax of 1 peso per liter. So when we say pass through, is that there was an increase of 1 peso per liter.
Okay. Thank you so much. And then there are quite many questions coming up. I hope you'll stay on. We'll take some of the questions at the end. There also seems to be a question from Dr. Neena Bhatia, who's also consortium partner, but I think she's an attendees, and we'll get her to the panelists to ask question later. We'll move on to the next presentation. Please, I request all the attendees to type in their questions in the Q&A box, or wait till the end of the session so that we can take a couple of questions addressed to all the speakers. Yes. Yes, Kiran, can you introduce the next speaker, please?
Yes, sir. It's my pleasure to invite our next speaker, Dr. Beena Varghese. She's a health economist with 25 years of rich experience in public health. She's currently working as a consultant for World Health Organization. She has expertise in economic evaluation, health financing, and health systems analysis. It's now I request Madam to speak on the topic, taxes for health, what, why, and how. Over to you, ma'am.
Can I share my screen, please?
Karen, you have to stop sharing the screen.
Yes, sir. Ma'am, you can share your screen.
Okay,
Visible, ma'am.
visible. Okay, great. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to be part of this panel. I do want to make a disclaimer that although I'm a consultant to WHO, I'm not a consultant on this topic to WHO. My discussion is more based on a work that we did recently. I was also with PHFI. I was a professor with PHFI till October 31st. So this work was, I did some work on this topic as part of my previous job. I won't go over the background of the presentation because, many of our the earlier speakers went through it, but I just wanted to highlight maybe a couple of points which are very specific to India. So in India, I think one of the, I think maybe Dr. Hemlata did mention about more than half of the adults being overweight and obese, as per the survey that was done in 2018. And also the one fact that I want to highlight is that India is the largest producer and consumer of sugar in the world. And this is as per the data that was available from 2022. An average Indian consumes 25 kilos of sugar per year, and the global average is 22, which is the 25 kilos is 5 times what WHO recommends as what one should be, consuming for a healthy living. And the other area, I think one of the questions that came through Dr. Subbarao the last time was about the large amount of sweets and confectioneries that we eat in India. And the food processing industry actually consumes 50 to 60% of the edible sugar, salt, and fats that are produced in this country. So when we think about taxes, I found this on the net, and I thought this sort of explains why we should tax and how tax can help. So when something is at $1 or a rupee or whichever currency we are looking at, we think it's good. If you increase it to by say twice the amount or whatever X amount, then we will all reduce consumption. That's sort of a known fact, and that's where taxation as one of the policies to impact consumption of unhealthy foods comes in. Again, many of these points have been reiterated by the previous speakers. So quickly, I think the only place I want to highlight is the fact that the WHO recommends that there should be a 20% increase in the prices of especially the SSB prices, because that is what has been modeled and studied the most, and a 20% increase in the prices of the sugar sweetened beverages will lead to a reduction in overweight and obesity. And the estimate and the Indian modeling studies done in 2014 suggested that the reduction could be somewhere between 3% and for obesity and 1.6% for diabetes. So this was again a study from 2014. And a recent study, I think one of our panelists is here, John is here. So his study also showed that if you want to see a 10% decline in the consumption of SSBs in India, our tax rate would have to be at least 57%. Currently, we are at 40% taxes for SSBs. And if you want to see a 10% decline, the taxes would have to increase to 57%. And John, correct me if I got the numbers incorrect or something. So when we think of health taxes, I mean, this is again for the panelists and members who are not economists. Others, for the economists, it's very simple. Even for non-economists, it's very simple concept that if you increase the prices, demand of all products go down. And how one way of increasing prices is through taxation. So in India, we have a base price, we have a goods and service tax, and if we say that let's add something call it a health tax or call it a food tax, whatever name we want to give it, if you add that tax, obviously the prices of these products will go up. And when the price of a product goes up, the demand goes down, and that is what economists call price elasticity. But basically, it's a well-known concept. But the way we measure or way we calculate elasticity is complex, and I'm not going to get into that. But if price elasticity numbers are available, in other words, if there is an understanding of what happens when prices go up by, say, 1%, what is the decrease in demand, how much demand will decrease. If there is some understanding through a price elasticity estimate, we can just use that estimate of price elasticity, multiply it with the change in prices, and then we have the change in demand. So when somebody says, okay, what will happen if I increase prices by 10%, then we can say, okay, that this will decrease demand by X if we know the price elasticity for the product. Now, I'll just give an example. The way we did it for our paper, this is very simple. Don't get bogged down by the specific number, just take the example of. So for our modeling purposes, we looked at sugar, sugar-sweetened beverages, and foods which are high in fats, salt, and sugars. So the base price of the product is 100 rupees, and the column B is basically the current rate of taxes. So for sugar, it is 18%. For sugar-sweetened beverages in India, it is 28%. And we have a 12% cess, so that's how it comes to 40%. And for the foods which are high in fat, sugar, and salt, which is the packaged foods, it is 12% current taxes. So if I add my base price with those, I get my current price, which is, for sugar, it will be, let's say, 118 rupees. Now comes, I want to add, as a policymaker, I want to see what will happen if I add a health tax. So we present 3 scenarios. So you could add a health tax. You can increase your taxes by a percent point, not percentage, by a percent point. So from 18%, I want to add 10%. So it's 18 plus 10. I make my taxes 28%. I want to try what happens if it increases, if I have a taxation of 20% on top of my 18%. So it is 18 plus 20, it becomes 38, so on and so forth. So when taxes increase by that particular amount, so if it increases, let's say, from 18% to 28%, prices very simply go from, which was the base price of 100. Earlier, my tax was 18. It went up to 118, and now my taxes went up to 28%. So it's 100 plus 28, the price is 28. On my screen, I'm unable to see the increase because I have let me just close this.
We are able to see your slides.
You are able to see, okay. Yeah. So there is the last column shows that there is an increase in X percent. Okay, now let me move it here. So for sugar as my example, so when I tax this product by 28% from, say, the current 18%, the percentage increase in prices that I end up with is 8%. If I decide that 20% is what I want to add my health tax as, then the increase in prices is 17%. So just to show that this is how the calculations can be done when India considers it's one possible way of doing this. Okay. Okay, for some strange reason, now I'm unable to move my slides.
You may unshare it once and share again, I think.
Okay, I think, yeah, okay. Sorry about this. Okay. Again, this is not a slide where I want you to go into specifics. This is just to, again, highlight, because you may hear the word price elasticity as a non-economist. You may think, okay, how the heck would I, does it mean anything? So again, I go back to the sugar example and I stick with the 28. Remember, it was 18%. I decided that I want to increase it by add another 10% to it. So my current tax rate is 28, and I ended up with a price increase of 8%. So price elasticity of sugar is not a number that is easily available anywhere. So we had to actually calculate it. Our paper is still not published, so I request other panelists and others not to share too much of this data. So this minus 0.20 is something that we had to estimate using the data that is available currently. So this is for all the other price elasticities. So for example, for the sugar sweetened beverages or for the HFSS, we picked up these numbers that you see 0.6, 0.94, or 0.53, 0.8. So these were all numbers available from the literature. For sugar, we did not have it. So we estimated this. So we estimated that the elasticity of sugar is 0.2, and anything which is way less than 1, which just means that people like you and me will have minimal impact in our demand when prices increase, because sugar is an essential product for our households. So this is a number that is believable. We don't expect that people will change their consumption hugely if there is small increases in prices. And so if I multiply minus 2.20 with this change in price is where I get how much the demand will decrease. So what we see here is that for sugar, if I increase my tax by 10% to 28% is as my final tax levy, the change in demand is going to be extremely minimal. It's like minus 1.7%. However, as part of our policy, we were thinking that asking households to reduce consumption of sugar may not be that essential, may not be much useful either, because we don't consume a lot. Most of our sugar consumption as such doesn't come from 2 or 3 or 5 kilos of sugar that we buy every month. It comes from the food that we eat, which contains sugar. It comes from the beverages that we drink that contain sugar. So our suggestion to the policymaker is that you tax the bulk consumers of sugar. And for them, we say that their elasticity would not be 0.2 because they would change their demand if prices increase, and it would be more likely at the higher end. And if that happens, even a 10% increase in taxation will have some impact on their consumption of sugar. And if you increase it to 38%, there will be a significant dent in the consumption or the purchase of sugar by the bulk consumers. So that is the point of the slide. The idea is not to dwell a lot on the numbers, but just to give a sense of how the estimates and how the numbers are done by people like us. So in a picture format, if you want to look at it, we have 3 possibilities of price elasticity. Minus 2.20, minus 0.20 is what we estimate. This would be for our households in India, where any amount of sort of price changes will have minimal impact on the demand for sugar. But for the bulk consumers, whom we assume is at the other end of the spectrum, and they are more closer to minus 0.7 in terms of their desire or their ability, their willingness to change consumption based on price increases. If you increase taxation by, let's say if taxes go up to 38%, will be a significant dent in their consumption. If it goes up to 48% taxes, the dent in the consumption would be even much higher. Now the question comes, I think one of you did raise in your presentation about revenue. The question always comes to policymakers, and this is an argument done by the industry too. People will consume less, therefore the government revenues will go down. So we did model that. And we find that there is absolutely no decrease in revenue possible. Even so on the x-axis, we have tax rate in percentages, and it goes up to large numbers. And this is the revenue that would be generated because of the taxes. And you see, you see very clearly that even for, like I said, even if we go up to 88% taxation, there is no decrease in revenue. So this is not a concern that the government should have, or the industry shouldn't sort of tell you that there could be a decrease in revenue, because that is not possible at all. So there would be huge increases in India in terms of the tax revenue that would happen, and that would also enable us then the question, what can we do with this revenue? And there was some discussion on what could be done. And what we recommend in our study is that it should be used for health promotion. It should be used for subsidies for healthy food alternatives, for prevention, and maybe some of it we may need to use it for treatment of NCDs. And I'll move on to the next slide. And I think this is the last one that I have. So we did talk about a few things that I think the other speakers did raise, and I do want to sort of reiterate that very clearly. If we want taxes to work, we must consider at least some of these. This is not a full list. There are others that obviously need to be considered and thought of, but at least these are the things that India must consider. One is alternatives of sugar. So there is non-nutritive sugar supplements. artificial sweeteners, which I think the speaker from Mexico, you mentioned that your country did not tax us. That is something I think that needs to be seriously thought about in India. Otherwise, it's much easy to substitute sugar with these artificial sweeteners. We must also increase access to and incentives. I think Dr. Meera Shekhar highlighted this, even the other speakers did highlight this, that the increase to access to and the incentives for our non-sweetened beverages, it could be pure fruit juices, clean water, fruits and vegetables, all this must be put in as part of the policy before we just increase taxes, because that wouldn't be useful at all. But most important, I feel, is the raising awareness about what happens when you eat and drink sugar sweetened beverages and on the foods which are high in salt, sugar and fats. And we must also incentivize. How can farmers produce more fruits and vegetables? How can consumers, how can we provide subsidies to people to buy more fruits and vegetables? So this is something that is not considered. I think, Meera, you mentioned that it is not considered by any country in the world. So India could be, sort of front runner in sort of using, or rather combining this policy with our policy of taxation. And to me also, it is highly important that we stop the very aspirational looking advertisement for all our drinks in India, because we have Bollywood stars, movie stars, our sports people advertising for it, which makes these products highly aspirational. And anything that is aspirational, people would not want to reduce the consumption of it. Rather, whatever is the price, they may want to buy it. So I think that's something advertising has to be, and food labeling. That many of the earlier speakers also talked about that. And I was happy to see that the speaker from Mexico talked about the adjustment for inflation, which is very important. That if we introduce the taxes, it must be adjusted for inflation and the average increase in household income. So this is something that we must consider. I think to end, I would just say that taxes, awareness, easier access, all of this put together would lead to a decrease in consumption of these products in India. And I hope Niti Aayog and the government does consider this as a policy option. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Veena. That was very nice presentation. And then you've clearly demonstrated how taxes on sugars can reduce their consumption, at least their usage in big industry and things like that. Of course, at individual level, it is very difficult to change or bring about behavior change in terms of diet and the food habits. There is a question, I think you can also take this. Should the proposed regulations of HFSS food, let's say taxation, be applicable to traditional sweets and savories? That still continues to be a question. Because again, we have a lot of these traditional sweets and savories sold in an organized sector. And added to that is a question related to impact of taxation on reformulation of products in Mexico. I think we'll take that question later, but we'll take this question first as to how do we see the process or the possibility of taxing the traditional sweets and savories?
I'm hoping that this could come in through what I was suggesting in terms of the bulk consumer. So that if there is if most of our sweet are produced by people who would not buy sugar in to 1 or 2 kilos, they are buying in larger quantities. So if there is a policy which says even sugar is purchased more than X kilos, would we be able to introduce a tax for those sort of for those sort of consumers? And that when that happens, I think we would be able to affect the pricing and the consumption of our sweetmeats, which all of us, including me, we all love to eat. But when prices of samosas and gulab jamuns all go up, we will eat them less. So yeah.
Dr. Meera, you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. That was a very interesting conversation. I have a question which may sound a little bit naive because I haven't been in India for some time now. But if I recall correctly, some time ago, sugar as such was subsidized by the government of India. So through ration shops, you would get sugar. I don't know if that is still the case or not. If that is the case, we seem to be at odds with trying to reduce the consumption of sugar among the poor and at the same time giving subsidies for sugar versus subsidies for healthier foods that we've talked about. And secondly, a quick comment to say, several of the speakers have said we should earmark the tax revenues for healthier foods or for related efforts. But in fact, my colleagues who work at the World Bank who work on taxation design tell me that because budgets are fungible, that in fact earmarking has never really worked very well in most countries. So I just want to put it out there and hear if there are others who've heard a little bit more about that. I think the only country that has done reasonably well with earmarking taxes is Thailand, and may be useful to look at that experience. Over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can
please.
I just I just want to come back on this the ration shop and the subsidies for sugar. It still exists, Meera. It is an important part of households in India, and I have no issues with the subsidies. The reason being that a poor household consumes 1 kilo or maximum 2 kilos of sugar, and that's all they get. That doesn't really affect the amount of, they put in their tea, they put in their coffee. But what really affects us is the samosas and the gulab jamuns, and because the Coke and Pepsi is highly aspirational, even those poor households actually would rather let go of not buying some things which are essential in their households and will want to buy what, I don't want to say Shah Rukh Khan because I've never seen him advertise, but the other Khans or the other Kapoors or whatever, they all advertise for these drinks. And I remember I think it was, one of the popular guys saying, you could jump mountains if you drink Mountain Dew or 7-Up or something like that. That makes it highly aspirational. So the ration shop subsidies for sugar, to me, is fine because they only consume 1 or 2 kilos. But the bulk consumer, so if that is why I said, if we say that, if you buy sugar more than, 10 kilos, I'm just making up the number. I don't know. This is something that we need to study. But if it is more than X number of kilos, and then the taxation come into that in the picture, then maybe that would actually make a difference, is what I feel. Thanks.
Okay, I think Dr. Meera, the example of Thailand perhaps is because Thailand's political scenario is very, very in favor of promoting healthy foods, and it's a pro-nutrition government always. I think that's one of the reasons. Okay, let's move on to the next important part of the e-dialogue, the panel discussion. And I request my colleagues to introduce the panelists first, and Dr. Sanjay will take over from there as a moderator.
Hello, so our next segment will be the panel discussion, and which will be moderated by Dr. Sanjay Pandey. He is the lead consultant, Indian National Policy, Global Health Advocacy Incubator, India. Dr. Sanjay has over 20 years of experience and has a doctorate in economics from IIT Kanpur. His experience includes providing strategic vision, leadership, technical expertise, management, oversight, project planning and implementation, development of new programs, state and national level advocacy, rural relationship management, and providing managerial support to governments and civil society organizations. Now, I request my colleague, Ms. Kiranmay, to introduce our panelists.
Yes, thank you, Reshma. It's my pleasure to invite our panelists, Mr. Hemant Kumar Meena. He's the Deputy Secretary of WCD Department, Niti Aayog. Mr. Hemant Kumar Meena is an Indian Forest Service officer of Maharashtra cadre. Various initiatives for livelihood generation as well as food and income securities have been taken by him. In Niti Aayog, as Deputy Secretary in Women and Child Development vertical, he is looking after child and maternal nutritional policies. Now I would like to invite our next panelist, Mr. George Cherian. He's the director of CUTS International Jaipur. Mr. George is a member of Central Advisory Committee of Food Safety and Standards Authority of India and was a member during 2014 to 19. He is also a member of Food Hygiene, Safety Management and Other Systems Sectional Committee of the Bureau of Indian Standards. He was a member of the stakeholders group on front of the pack food labeling of Food Safety Standards Authority of India and a member of Food Authority as special invitee during 2021 to 2022. He is also a member of Central Consumer Protection Council of Government of India since 2007. He's also the vice chairperson of the Consumer Coordination Council of India, which is the Apex Consumer Council in India. I welcome you, sir. Now, I would like to introduce and welcome our next panelist, Dr. Rijo John. He's an economist and public health policy analyst. Dr. John does independent research and technical consulting for several institutions, including the World Health Organization, University of Illinois at Chicago, and Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, among others. He's also an associate professor of economics at the Rajgiri College of Social Sciences, Kochi, and a guest faculty of the Indian Institute of Management. He formerly worked as assistant professor of economics at the Indian Institute of Technology, Jodhpur. Now I request our moderator, Dr. Sanjay sir, to take over the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kiran. And it's really my pleasure. And we are so proud that we have got three panelists who are from the different background, from Niti Aayog, from consumer organization, and a public health policy analyst and economist. So I welcome all. And I straightway go to the panel discussion. And I will request all panelists to really have their comments, very critical comments on the questions which I will post before them. And the first round of question, and then if the time permits, then we will go for the second round. So Dr. Hemant, I would like to really just ask the question, given the background of the very eminent scholars, they have really presented the scenario for India. Should the government tax food and beverages which have got high in fat, sugar and salt? And if yes, then what do you think that the problems will be there for materializing the policy of taxing such unhealthy foods? Because you are in such a position where you can visualize those problems for really taxing those things. So over to you, Dr. Hemant.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjay. Thank you. First of all, let me thank NIN for inviting me for this discussion, for this panel discussion. As you are all aware that as per NFHS 5, if you see the data, overweight and obesity in children has risen from 2.1% to 3.4%. And this trend has been across the India, barring few states. In every state, the prevalence of overweight and obesity has increased. And whenever this kind of changes happen, we may think of taxation as one of the policy instrument for discouraging consumption of food which are unhealthy food, high in fat, sugar, and salt. As my previous speaker has told about, there are lots of positive evidence that increasing in taxes can reduce the consumption. But I see that most of the evidence is for sweetened beverages, SSBs. And in India also, we have around 40% taxes on the same. If you see the data of India regarding consumption of these beverages, the quantum of the sales has increased over the year despite these taxes. So somehow we need to go deeper into the psychology of the consumer before for evaluating the impact of these taxes. Apart from this, we haven't, there are countries in which food taxes on the food have been introduced, but the experience and the evidence is limited, and the results are also but not very encouraging, as some of the countries like Denmark, Finland, Norway, they have repealed their taxes on food. If you see the data more closely of NFHS 5, and if you do the analysis wealth quintile wise, then you see that the poorest wealth quintile, in the poorest wealth quintile, around 2.7% children are overweight. In the wealthiest, it is just double, around it is 4.8%. And if you segregate this data urban and rural wise, then in the lowest, again the same trend is repeating in the urban. Means in the lowest wealth quintile, it is around 2%. In the highest wealth quintile, it is 5%. In the rural, similarly 2.7%, and in the highest 4.2%. So I'm saying that merely increasing the tax will not have that kind of impact, because urban people have that capacity, that affordability for the food. They can always purchase these unhealthy food at the higher prices. And further, and if you think these companies who are making this so-called packaged food, they can always reduce the size of the packet. They can always reduce shrinkflation, which we call. They can reduce the size of the packet and sell the lower quantity in the similar price. So means making this inflation invisible kind of thing. And further, in rural areas, if you see, the sales is increasing, and most of the sales is in informal economy. If you see the street food in the villages, you can find the fried burgers there, and which have no labels, nothing, and they are using that oil multiple times. So which is and the food is also cheap. So it is the problem is multi-pronged, and for this, since India is such a large country, and every state has very specific problem. If you go in Ladakh, the prevalence is around 13% for overweight children, and Madhya Pradesh is about 2%. So we have to devise the policies as per the need of the state governments. Means, I mean to say, we have to understand this problem deeply. What has worked in other countries may not work here, because the psychology of the consumer, the role of the industries, and how this taxation work in Indian context is very different. So there is no clear-cut answer of this question whether government should introduce tax or not. We have to think from the perspective of the Indian consumer, what can impact them most. And further, we need to perhaps this subject needs more research, and more research from the perspective of taxation on food, and as well as consumer psychology. And NIN is recently doing What India Eats Total Diet Survey, which can perhaps give more insight into this question. Thank you, Dr. Sanjay. These are some of the comments.
Oh, thank you so much. And you really raised a very valid point that India is such a diverse country, right, from Ladakh to the Kerala, or from west to east, where one kind of a thing will not be really fit for all these things. And also consumer awareness would really leads to a lot of, and consumer psychology, as you pointed it out, that is very important to understand before we take any taxation or any measures on that. So that's why we do have George, who have really good understanding of the consumer. So, George, I would like to really ask you the question that what do you think that should the government tax food and beverages which have got HFSS, and also if such food are taxed more and become expensive, do you think that there is a possibility that these food can be seen as a food of affluent and will not be aspirational value for the foods? And also, what do you think? The question which was raised that what would the consumer, they will see the taxes and they will view the taxes. Would that lead to the lower consumption, or would that lead to the kind of awareness also to the consumer? So over to you, George.
Thanks, Sanjay. Glad to be part of this panel, and I also thank the organizers. With regard to this specific question, we don't have much evidence gathered from India, but like many had mentioned, there are a lot of successful, practices and evidence from across the world. Already about Mexico, a lot is already mentioned. If you take Denmark, 2011, Denmark is the country first which introduced the fat tax in 2011, when 2.14 euros per kg of saturated fat for products with more than 2.3 gram per 100 gram of saturated fat, when it was introduced, there was a 4% reduction in consumption, and also it resulted in 0.4% reduction in the premature death. Same with Hungary also, which was introduced followed by Denmark in 2011, 4% of increase introduced the sin tax, which resulted in reduction of consumption of processed food by 3.4% and the unprocessed food by 1.1%. Coming to India, we have the experience of working in the tobacco sector. We all had advocated, and before the GST came, it was almost 50%, though various states were having different excise duty and above the VAT and things like that. It was an average of 50% tax on the retail price of tobacco. Again, it varies depending upon the length of the cigarette, and the BDs was about 15% and all. And it shows that the global adult tobacco survey shows that between 2010 and 17, the consumption of smokeless tobacco reduced by 4.5%, and the smokers reduced by 3.5%. Again, when the GST was introduced, presently it is about 52%, because tobacco is in the highest slab in the GST is 28%. And it is put over that the compensation cess is there, national calamity, contingent duty is there. Putting together, it is 52%, which comes. But still, it is much lesser than the tax proposed by WHO, which is, is about 75%. Last 5 years, we are taking only 2020 was the last budget, changes with regard to the tax. It shows people working in this sector shows that in the last 5 years, since there is no change, the number of smokers are again increasing. Global example shows that an increase in 10% of the tax is resulting in about 4% of the reduction in the number of smokers and things like that. But it has to be at a level which is not affordable for common consumers. That is the thing which we can apply in the HFSS as well. And it should not be available from any other source. For example, in the case of Denmark, 2011, it was introduced the saturated fat tax, but 2013 it was withdrawn. The reason was, one is from the industry pressure. Second thing was people also crossed to Germany where this product was available at a much, lesser price. So such situation should not be there. I always say Kerala, the tax of liquor is presently 251% is the total on the retail price. But within Kerala itself, there is a small place called Mahi, which comes under the Union Territory. So the tax there is much lower than this. So people cross to the Union Territory, drink and come back because you can't carry across the border and things like that. But coming back to your question, the impact assessment done by WHO in various European countries among the people who reduce the consumption, it shows that 80% of the people said the reason for their reduction in consumption is the increased price of the product. And 20% said, they became aware about the health aspect of, this product, especially about the unhealthy ingredients and things like that. So the high taxation should follow with the increased consumer awareness, and people should be able to understand the unhealthy thing. And coming back to your point, whether the consumers will abandon this project, we have one example. Somebody had mentioned in the slide also. In 2016, the finance minister in Kerala introduced first time a fat tax among the products like burgers, pizzas, donuts and all. He was targeting mainly few of the companies like McDonald's, Domino's, Subway and things like that. So that time it was only 14.5% he had proposed, but all the companies said we are not going to bear this tax. We will straight away pass on to the consumers this 14.5% of that. That is the reason I said if it is a smaller amount, you cannot reduce the consumption. Unfortunately, this was not introduced, and by the time it came to introduction 2017, the states had moved into the GST, but it had triggered a lot of debate. That was the first time in India any state government had proposed a fat tax on that. That is the reason I said this has to be a substantial hike in the taxation, which should not be should make the common consumers these products not affordable for them. Then we can succeed in the highest taxation. This also result in health awareness about the product. And one more thing I want to just mention. The idea is not to increase. This also should result in the reformulation of the product. We have a very clear example from UK, when UK had introduced the industry levy. In 2016, most of the beverages was having more than 10 grams of sugar in the product. But by 2019, most of them had reformulated, and the sugar content was less than 5% there. So we need to engage with the industry also, and this taxation should result in increased awareness among the consumers. At the same time, should encourage the industry to reformulate the product within the agreed threshold. I will stop here. Over to you, Sanjay. Thank you.
Thanks, George. And you raised really good points with the evidences from the country or the other countries into that. That's really great. The straight way I will really go to our economist and health policy analyst, Dr. Rizzo. Dr. Rizzo, you heard George's point of view. And do you think that the taxation to HFSS food should be high taxes on that? And also, what is your opinion? Because George has mentioned about Kerala experience. So can you please let us know that what was the problems of implementing such policies by the state if they really want to do that? And your thoughts on this? Yeah, Rizzo?
Thank you, Sanjay, and also thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure, and it was very interesting to listen to many of the expert speakers before. For me, this is the first time I'm attending these panels here. Anyway, I largely agree with most of the main points that previous speakers raised. One of the key, my experience over the last several years has been working in the area of, economics of tobacco control. And I really see that, when I go through the literature on sugar sweetened beverages, I really see that a lot of similarities exist. And there's a lot of similarities, and there's so much scope to replicate the kind of experiments that we did in many countries for regulating tobacco consumption can equally be applied on regulating HFSS too. That's what my understanding is. And in fact, I also believe that, for example, the first speaker, Dr. Meera, was talking about many arguments that the industry makes. And I can clearly see the similarities there. The tobacco industry keeps making the exact same arguments to prevent tax increases, because the tax increases that is something that really hits their bottom line, and the industry do not like tax increase no matter what. So first of all, we cannot engage with the industry, because they will try to stop any attempt to increase taxes. That is for sure. And the tobacco industry has been successfully doing that in many countries, and we have several examples from many countries. We don't want that happening again in this particular industry too. Similarly, the industry makes arguments about job losses. Tobacco industry makes the same arguments. And then the Professor Catherine talked about regressivity issues, which she acknowledges that it is indeed a concern in some places. But I see that in India, at least the SSB consumption is mostly among the higher income group of people, and not in the lower income group. When I was looking and examining the NSSO data on consumption of these sugar-sweetened beverages, I saw that the per capita consumption among the rich quintile is almost many times higher than the per capita consumption in the lower income quintile. So when you increase the taxes, it's really not hitting the poor as one might think. At least in the case of India for the time being, because the consumption is heavily concentrated among the rich than the poor on a relative basis. And that is this is also substantiating or complementing the fact the previous speaker, Mr. Hemant, raised about obesity, high prevalence of obesity among richer quintiles compared to the lower poorer quintiles. This is also a reflection of the fact that the consumption of HFSS and SSBs are relatively much higher in that group of consumers compared to the poorer group of consumers. So there is a clear reasoning why the taxes should be imposed, and heavy taxes should be imposed on these products. Tobacco control is a living example of that. And the reductions in consumption of tobacco use prevalence that India and many other countries experience because of higher taxes, as pointed out by the previous speaker also, is a testimony to the effectiveness of raising taxes. But one of the major point of raising taxes is that it should make the product less and less affordable. But on that front, I published this study for WHO. It was published in this year, early this year. In that we looked at how the affordability of SSBs in India has changed over time. And I want to quote one sentence from that study. It took actually 10.1% of annual per capita income to purchase 100 liters of SSBs in the year 2006 or 7, whereas to purchase the same amount of 100 liters of SSBs in the year 2018-19, it took only 4.1% of the per capita income. So that clearly shows that these products have become so much more affordable in India over the time. It's one thing that India has a very high taxes. It imposes a 28% GST and a 12% compensation cess. But as the previous speaker rightly pointed out, ever since the introduction of the GST, these rates of taxes that applied on these products have remained the same. Over the last more than 5 years in a row, there has not been any revision in the tax of these products, right? But this is quite unlike the pre-GST regime, wherein many state governments were able to raise, VAT rates at least. Of course, the excise tax would remain the same across the country, but the VAT rates could be changed by each state government as they would like, we had states like Punjab and Maharashtra imposing 30% or 25% VAT on SSBs, whereas there were other states which had only 10 to 12% VAT rate, So, I mean, if the states wanted, they could actually increase. But now the tax hikes are always completely resting with the GST Council, and it is a single tax across the country. And because of which, unless the GST Council decides to revise these taxes on a regular basis, it's going to be very detrimental. And another problem is that in India now, with the introduction of GST, the entirety of the taxes that is applied on SSBs is ad valorem in nature. And what do you mean by ad valorem tax? It is like a percentage tax. I'm just making it very simple. A percentage tax applied on the retail price, right? So there is a tendency for, when there is an ad valorem tax, there is a tendency for the retail prices to go down, because there's a companies companies who are engaged in the sales of these products have an incentive to keep the retail prices low when there is ad valorem taxes. It's a very well-known fact, and that is why WHO and many other institutions, they recommend, for tobacco taxes, they strongly recommend having more specific taxes. Specific taxes means it's a unit tax, So when there is a unit tax, any price increase or any producer price increase would benefit the industry, and it incentivizes them to raise the prices higher, and that of course discourages consumption. That's understanding. So we need to find a way to move away from an ad valorem taxation system currently applied to a more specific taxation, or at least a mixed kind of system wherein we have both specific and ad valorem taxation. That will be more useful in terms of regulating the consumption of these products. That's my opinion. And now coming back to the question on Kerala's taxation, Mr. George quite clearly stated the issues there. Kerala introduced this 14.5% tax on HFSS items. But this was the first experiment in India, but unfortunately the timing was quite bad, I would say, because it was done in 2016, and by 2017 we had moved into a GST system. So the state really couldn't reap the benefit of this policy reform, nor could it really assess the impact, if any, it had made on the consumption of this product. For that, what actually missed was that, there was actually no baseline survey done by the state before the introduction of this tax to know what was the prevailing consumption patterns of these products in the state, and how are the state, the obesity patterns, etc. Such a baseline survey would have been very useful to analyze the impact of this policy reform, let's say after 1 or 2 years from its introduction, but that was missing. But as George rightly said, this tax, the very name itself was fat tax. It's quite attractive, I would say. The fat tax was the name that was given. So obviously, it created a lot of public debate, and many of the local news media channels had this on debate for several days. And I think to create, in terms of creating a good public awareness, this has been very highly useful. But one other problem was that this particular taxation applied only to these corporate food chains, like McDonald's and stuff. That is somewhat discriminatory in nature, because your objective should be to regulate the consumption of HFSS. There you cannot have a discrimination based on commercial sales, between who sells it, between the suppliers, you can't discriminate. So, well, I mean, Kerala's left-leaning government has their own reasons to tax corporate food chains. But of course, nonetheless, it still generated a lot of debate. But I would have liked, instead of imposing a tax on only HFSS food in corporate food chains, it would have been more useful to introduce this tax on, fat-rich products, or, even food served by local caterers and bakeries, which sold food with high fat threshold. Those would have been more effective. So I think these kind of reforms really need a lot of planning. It needs coordination from across different departments of the government. It should have a system in place to measure its, quantify the impact over time, and maybe even collect taxes under separate heads to really assess whether this kind of reform has really brought an added revenue to the government. You need to have, you should be able to get the tax revenue separately for these products alone. The governments who introduce this kind of taxation system can have these sort of systems in place to assess the impact and make better policies. So I guess I sort of covered what I wanted to cover. So going forward, I strongly recommend very high taxes applied on these products, but without any discrimination. Some people were, there was a question whether it is good to tax these products, sweet products produced by domestic industry and stuff. In tobacco taxation also, there is a discrimination when it comes to taxing BDs compared to cigarettes. BDs, because it is largely perceived as a poor man's pleasure and a completely domesticated production done in the unorganized sector. The tax treatment has been very favorable for the BD. It has been highly negligible. Tax has been highly negligible for BDs. As a result, the consumption of BD or BD smoking in India is many times more than cigarette smoking, simply because a pack of BD is available at the price of a stick of cigarettes. So that's so for every one cigarette consumer, you will find at least 7 to 8 BD consumers in India. So the idea, but we all know that the BD is as harmful as cigarettes, and there is no public health reason why this product should be taxed any lesser compared to cigarettes. So similarly, we should not distinguish between products which are traditional, or traditional snacks, or in a corporate produced products. That should not be the criteria at all when it comes to taxation, because our goal is to reduce the consumption of HFSS in general and reduce the sugar intake as much as possible. So there should not be any discriminatory, the policies should not be discriminatory in nature. So I rest with that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rijo. It was really wonderful time, and I am because of the paucity of time, it's already we crossed the 5:30 limit. You can see. So thank you so much, my panelist, Mr. Hemant, George, and Dr. Rijo. It was wonderful, and I believe that the kind of agreement is that we should have the high taxation to curb the consumption of the HFSS food, along with the awareness of the consumer, and also keeping consumers kind of a psychology and behavior in mind. So over to you, Dr. Subbarao, because you have certain questions collected from the Q&A box, and you can take it there. And once again, thank you so much, my dear panelist. It was wonderful to talking to you and having your thoughts on this subject. Thank you.
I also thank all the panelists, especially Dr. Hemant and Dr. Cherian. And thank you very much, Dr. Sanjay, for efficiently handling the panel discussion. I know we have many more questions slated, but we are running out of time and there is so much to discuss. I wish and hope we will be able to get together once again for another round of discussion. But however, there is one question that has been lingering in my head always about the taxation. Usually the perception is that if the price of a particular food is really high, it is seen as the food of the affluents. So if increasing the price of a particular food, I mean, in this case, unhealthy food with additional taxes, if it increases the price, does it increase the aspirational value of that particular food? I mean, this is a question that was always lingering in mind. Any one of you can quickly take this and then we'll move to the next segment.
Well, if I may, you know, in economics, we have these kind of products we call, you know, snowmobiles, you know, products with some kind of snowmobile, right? But I do not really think that these HFSS or SSBs would fall into that kind of a category at all. In fact, we have, I mean, in fact, the study that we published this year, which actually looked at the price elasticity or, you know, the price responsiveness of consumers towards this product, and it clearly shows that people do respond to price increases, meaning there is a negative response to price increase. With the price elasticity of negative less than, it was about 0.9 in my study, which we published this year. So it shows that when there is a 10% increase in price, there is a 9% decline in consumption. So it's clearly not, you know, if there was this aspirational aspect that you're talking about, then we shouldn't be, we should be seeing an increased consumption along with an increased price, but that's really not the case. At least the empirics data from India doesn't show that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Subbarao, can I just make, not just on the point that you have raised, with regard to taxation, as of now, we have a limitation, like I mentioned, 28% is the maximum tax in the GST. Already, many of the aerated drinks, colas are in this 28% category. Further to increase, we can adjust only in the cess, increasing the cess. So how far we will be able to increase the cess? Otherwise, GST 28% is the maximum. That is number one. Maybe Niti Aayog or somebody need to work on that. Second point, what is the definition of HFSS in India? What is the unhealthy? Yes. We are struggling with, I am part of the CAC of FSSAI for FOPL. We are fighting. Now, FSSAI had rejected the WHO CRO threshold and made their own threshold, which is much higher than the WHO CRO threshold. And if we go by INR, can we take it as any product which is having less than 2.5 star as unhealthy? Or what is the definition of that? You know, we are struggling if we are going for the star rating and things like that, you know. So then only we can decide on, you know, which are the products that we should identify for taxing. So these questions also, I think, for our wider discussion. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. We got these questions even during FOPNL debate. And in fact, when we tweeted this about the 50 dialogue, one of the, you know, followers had raised this question. First, you guys define what is HFSS and then debate about taxing them. While that debate always goes on, I just want to ask one last question to Dr. Hemant. Do we, do we at the policy level consider this as a ripe time for introducing the tax, or are we still a long way away from that particular debate?
Well, I would say food is a very complex system. It's unlike the tobacco, which is just one ingredient. Food has multiple components. It could be fat, sugar, salt, energy, and other number of ingredients here. So I think before attempting any introducing any tax, we should, as I earlier said, we should analyze the impact of the tax which we have already introduced on SSB, that is around 40%. How it has impacted. What is the impact of this? And further, we need further research in this area about how people see their food in rural areas, in urban areas. Like you said, whether if you increase the price of unhealthy food, it would be looked at food of affluence. It may not be true in some places. It may be true for certain households. So you do not know exactly. For me, if you increase the price of unhealthy food, it will not matter for me because I am sufficiently aware about it that I should not eat this kind of food. Right. And further, for introducing any tax like this, we have to take on board our industry. Like in earlier, you have seen about trans fats, the labeled in the food ingredient nutrition fact, trans fat was on the packets. But now, if you see the packets, no trans fat is available. Means industry has somehow understood this fact that they should make food healthy. So this soft nudging towards industry, taking them along, is required. And further, most of the food that we are eating is not the packaged food, but food we eat at home that can be as unhealthy as food we are eating outside. So it's more about behavior change. We need to give this education to our children, adolescents, and students about what to eat, what not to eat. Maybe this should be part of our curriculum.
Yes.
That is more, I think that is more important. And gradually, industry will also learn from these things. That what is, if consumer is sufficiently aware, then industry will also change its course according to the consumer. So we can have tax, but before that, we have to find out our reason for having tax.
Yeah. Thank you for that point. And we come to the last leg of the e-dialogue. I wish we had many more e-dialogues to discuss on this topic. I thank all the speakers and the panelists for their very, very insightful and thought-provoking points. But as a tradition, from the very first e-dialogue, we've been talking about, at the end of every e-dialogue, we come up with 5 key takeaways from the e-dialogue. For this e-dialogue, my 5 key takeaways would be that it takes a long time to bring a policy and implement food tax. It should start somewhere and somehow, and there is a need for clear advocacy for this. And I'm sure this e-dialogue is one such process to advocate for taxation of unhealthy foods, while the debates around defining unhealthy foods, what are unhealthy foods, where are we sourcing from, go on and on. But since, coming up with a policy on tax is a long drawn and iterative process, those iterations should start, and no other time than this for starting such debates. And second and most important is some of the studies have shown that increasing taxes from around the world, increasing taxes has really made some of the unhealthy food consumption to come down, and that too against the arguments that it would impact the lower income groups and things like that. The consumption seems to have come down even among the lower income groups because it is always said that these healthy foods, when they become very expensive, that place is being filled by unhealthy foods. If these also become perhaps expensive, then perhaps there is space for healthy options. And next is that health taxation, when introduced, should be adjusted to inflation from time to time, which is very, very important. Otherwise, there is a chance that the healthier options become expensive and the unhealthier foods remain at the same level. And whether the deploying of taxes back, revenue from the taxes into promoting nutrition or promoting nutritious foods is a good idea or not. There is lack of evidence on that from other parts of the world. However, it can be one of the reasons how we can advocate for healthy, taxation of unhealthy foods. We can tell the policymaker that the revenue got from there can be utilized for health promotion activities, which is a very good bait. But at the same time, we also cannot decide how the government uses the revenues that it gets. And we have to help them prioritize nutrition awareness and literacy as one of the important areas where this taxation revenue can be plowed back. And finally, if we start differentiating between foods produced in a large industry and foods produced at home and foods produced in an unorganized sector, and then say the taxation is applicable only for the industry. To get the industry work on it would be difficult. So when it comes to unhealthy foods, wherever you source it from, whether it is home or your street side or from the industry, the the example of BD that Dr. Rijo had given, explains this very well. So the basic thing, as Dr. Hemant has suggested, is that what is healthy and what is unhealthy should be defined, and also people should be able to make that kind of a choice. That's one. But taxation, when it is introduced, should cover all the foods irrespective of where they are from, and also we should move from ad valorem taxes to specific taxes. That's a key takeaway for me. And these are the 5 takeaways from this very important e-dialogue that we've had. And before I conclude and ask all the panelists who are online to switch on their cameras, I have a duty of saying thanks to many people who are behind the successful conduct of this e-dialogue, especially to put together this beautiful panel of people who have helped me are Purnima Menon from IFPRI, Catherine Bacoler herself, and then Preetu Mishra from UNICEF India, Dr. Sanjay, and also colleagues from WHO who have helped us put together this very good and interesting stellar presenters and panelists. And I would be failing in my duties if I don't thank our director, Dr. Hemlata, for all the support she's given through this year of 5 very important e-dialogues and taking time out every time for these e-dialogues despite our busy schedule. And my thanks also to my colleagues and my team, excellent team of Paramita, Reshma, Kiran Mai, and others. And many thanks to UNICEF India for sponsoring this particular e-dialogue series, and Niti Aayog for being very important partner in all this, and the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, and Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and Ministry of Education, and everyone. And also thanks to my colleagues for giving this particular e-dialogues a wide publicity. And if we can just go in for Dr. Preetu, if you're also around, we'll just go in for one quick snapshot. And thanks again to all the panelists who are joining from different parts of the world, staying awake at odd hours in the night. Thank you very much. Can we quickly take a screenshot? Yeah, we have very few of us, but anyways. One more. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Namaskar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, Guru Garu. सर ने कंफर्म किया? I am so sorry. Congratulations. So you are staying back for the NSA also. Have you registered? Register now. Yeah. Stay back for NSA. Yeah, tomorrow is open because the minister is coming. So you are here, no? We'll talk tomorrow morning. Guru garu, వాళ్ళకి ఇప్పుడు అది డాబ్స్ స్టడీ లేదంటున్నారు వాళ్ళు. డాబ్స్ స్టడీ ఇనాగరేషన్ ఏంటి అని అనునాగరు మేడం నాకు మెసేజ్ పంపించింది. సూపర్, యాక్చువల్లీ వీడియో కూడా స్టార్ట్ చేయించాను. Media photographer ఎవరైతే తీస్తారో, good job ladies. It's a very interesting topic and very beautiful talks, everyone. I think this itself is a very good paper to write, or many more popular articles to write. No, मैंने cut कर दिया. संजय को मैंने message किया and then I said 6 o'clock we'll wrap up, no more questions, because all questions have been answered now, and it's an ending debate. Yeah. And thank you so much. Yeah. Sir. Oh yeah, I'm managing. Tomorrow it's working day. Please, all of you come. You wanted to say something? 5 minutes hurry, I'll call you back. Okay. If you are not in a hurry, otherwise we can talk tomorrow morning. Sir, the photographer, videographer, photos, phone numbers share the professional photographer. Main thing is Srinivas Reddy చెప్పాలి అక్కడ ఫోటో అవుతుంటే వాట్సాప్ లో ఇమీడియట్లీ మాకు రావాలి బికాస్ మనం ఇది వాళ్ళు సోషల్ మీడియాలో ఇస్తాం ఇమీడియట్ రియల్ టైం కావాలి రియల్ టైం కొన్ని ఫోటోస్